Hi, my name is Claire Morgan. I'm 30 years old, and I'll never forget the day my family handed my sister a mansion. And me humiliation. It was a perfectly sunny Sunday, the kind that's supposed to feel hopeful. But for me, it felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for the axe to fall. As the casual, cruel laughter of my family echoed off the crystal glasses, my phone buzzed with an email that would change everything. An email that contained a truth so powerful it would not only shatter their world, but rewrite who really owned the future. But before I tell you how everything flipped, like and subscribe, and drop a comment to let me know where you are watching from. The air in my parents' dining room was always heavy, thick with the scent of my mother's expensive Casablanca lilies and the unspoken weight of expectation. It wasn't a comfortable weight, like a warm blanket on a cold night, but the oppressive, suffocating pressure of a world I never quite fit into. Driving up the long, winding driveway to the estate always felt like a journey back in time, a regression to the quiet, overlooked child I used to be. The wrought iron gates, embossed with a large, pretentious M, groaned open like the entrance to a fortress. And as I parked my sensible sedan between my father's gleaming Bentley and my sister's cherry-red sports car, I felt the familiar sense of being an imposter in my own childhood home. Inside, the house was a museum of my father's success. The floors were Italian marble, cold and echoing underfoot, reflecting the light from colossal chandeliers that dripped with crystals. Oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors stared down from the walls, their eyes seeming to judge my practical, off-the-rack navy blazer. The staff moved with a practiced, silent efficiency, their faces impassive masks of professionalism. They offered to take my coat, their voices low and respectful, but their eyes held no recognition. To them, I was just a recurring visitor, not a daughter of the house. In their minds, as in my parents', that role belonged solely to Amelia. Sunday brunch was a ritual, a command performance where we all played our meticulously assigned roles. My father, Richard Morgan, presided from the head of the long mahogany table, a king surveying his domain. He was a man built of sharp angles and expensive suits, his charisma a weapon he wielded with casual precision. My mother, Eleanor, sat to his right, a vision of fragile elegance in cream-colored cashmere. Her role was to be a beautiful, silent endorsement of his power, her smiles and nods the punctuation to his pronouncements. And my sister, Amelia, was the princess, the glittering heir apparent, the living embodiment of all their ambitions. I was the footnote, a necessary but inconvenient part of the family portrait, the spare daughter they never quite knew what to do with. I took my usual seat, the one strategically placed just outside the gravitational pull of the main conversation, but too close to completely disappear. It was a physical manifestation of my place in the family, present, but not participating. Amelia, naturally, arrived last. Punctuality was for the little people. She didn't just enter a room, she conquered it. That day, she wore a flowing silk dress the color of a perfect sunrise, a creation that shimmered with every step and likely cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. Her blonde hair was a halo of professionally styled waves, her smile a dazzling display of perfect teeth and practiced charm. She moved through the room like a zephyr, kissing the air near our mother's cheek and giving our father a hug that was both affectionate and performative. "There she is," my father boomed, his face lighting up with a genuine adoration he never showed me. "The star of the show," Amelia laughed, a light musical sound that always grated on my nerves. "Oh, Daddy, stop it." She glanced at me, her eyes doing a quick, dismissive scan of my outfit. "Claire, you're here already. So punctual." It was meant to sound like a compliment, but we both knew it was an insult. It was her way of calling me boring, predictable, and unimportant. The meal began, a parade of tiny, exquisitely arranged dishes served on heavy, gold-rimmed plates. Quail eggs, smoked salmon, a thimbleful of champagne. It was food designed to be looked at, not eaten. As the staff cleared the plates, my father tapped his crystal glass with a heavy silver spoon. The clear, ringing sound cut through the low hum of conversation, a summons for our attention. A self-satisfied smirk played on his lips, the telltale sign he was about to remind everyone of his power and influence. "Well, now that we're all here," he began, his voice resonating with theatrical importance, "Eleanor and I have decided it's time to formalize a few things. A family like ours is not just a collection of people. It is a legacy, an enterprise, and every enterprise needs a clear line of succession." My stomach, already uneasy from the rich food, did a slow, cold roll. I knew this was coming. I had been dreading it for months, I just didn't know how cruel the execution would be. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket and produced 2 envelopes, placing them side by side on the polished table. The contrast was a deliberate, calculated cruelty. One was a thick, heavy portfolio envelope made of creamy, expensive cardstock tied with a silk ribbon. It radiated importance. The other was a standard white business envelope, thin and flimsy, an afterthought. With a grand gesture, he slid the thick portfolio across the table to Amelia. Her perfectly manicured fingers, adorned with a diamond that caught the light, closed around it. "Amelia," he said, his voice swelling with a pride that filled the entire room. "You have always understood what it means to be a Morgan. You have charm, you have grace, and you have the ambition to carry our name forward. Your mother and I feel that, as the future face of the Morgan brand, you deserve a home that reflects your station. This is for you." Amelia opened it with a practiced slowness designed to maximize the drama of the moment. She pulled out a thick stack of documents bound in leather. I recognized the letterhead of my father's law firm instantly. She let out a delicate, theatrical gasp, placing a hand over her heart. "Oh, Daddy," she breathed, her voice trembling with faux surprise. Is this really the deed to this house?" he confirmed, gesturing expansively at the grand dining room, the gardens visible through the windows, the very air we were breathing. "The mansion, the grounds, the stables, all of it. It's yours, sweetheart. We'll be moving into the city penthouse full-time. Furthermore," he added, tapping the portfolio, "that contains the controlling shares in the family's primary investment fund, a portfolio of blue-chip stocks, international properties, and venture capital. It's a significant responsibility, but I know you're up to the task." My mother reached over and squeezed Amelia's hand, her eyes glistening. "We are so proud of the woman you've become, darling." In that moment, I ceased to exist. The air was sucked out of my corner of the universe. They were carving up the world, and I wasn't even on the map. The mansion wasn't just brick and mortar to me. It was the repository of every memory I had. It was where I'd learned to read, tucked away in the dusty, sunlit library. It was where I'd scraped my knee on the stone steps by the garden, and our grandfather had carried me inside. It was where I had hidden with books when my family's relentless noise and performative happiness became too much to bear, and he had just given it away like a corporate asset, a prize in a one-person contest. Then, my father's attention turned to me. The warmth in his eyes evaporated, replaced by a look of weary obligation. He picked up the thin white envelope. He didn't slide it with care. He flicked it with his index finger. It skittered across the vast expanse of polished mahogany and came to a stop just short of my water glass. A piece of white trash on a sea of dark wood. "And Claire," he said, his tone shifting from proud benefactor to a man performing a reluctant minor duty, "we haven't forgotten you, of course." The "of course" was the most insulting part. It was a lie, and we all knew it. My hands felt numb and clumsy as I picked it up. It was so light it felt empty, a hollow gesture. Inside was a single, slightly creased sheet of paper. It was the deed to an old duplex on Cedar Street, located on the far edge of town in a neighborhood he often referred to as transitional, his code for rundown and irrelevant. It was a forgotten asset, a piece of administrative cleanup he had dressed up as a gift. He hadn't given me a piece of the family legacy. He had given me a chore. "It's a fixer-upper, certainly," my father said with a dismissive wave of his hand, as if shooing away a fly. "But it generates some rental income. I'm sure you, with your little projects, can make something of it. A nice starter asset for you to practice on." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken meaning. They were all looking at me, my father with his condescending benevolence, my mother with her pitying gaze, Amelia with her triumphant smirk. They were waiting for me to be grateful for the scraps from their table. I had to force my lips into a thin, polite smile. It was a muscular action, requiring immense effort. "Thank you, Father," I said. My voice was a stranger's, hollow but steady. Years of practice had taught me how to mask the tremor. Amelia, clutching the deed to a multi-million-dollar estate, looked over at me with that smile, the one that said she was trying to be kind but couldn't quite hide her ecstatic glee. Then, for the benefit of the extended family members present, she delivered the final, crushing blow. "Oh, that's so sweet," she said, her voice like honey laced with poison. She turned to her fiancé, a vacuous man named Preston whose primary qualification was his own family's wealth. "It's good for Claire to have a real project. Maybe she can rent one of my guest houses someday, when she's ready to move up in the world." And then came the laughter. It wasn't a single unified roar. It was worse, a collection of soft, layered, cruel sounds. my father's deep, rumbling chuckle that signaled his approval, my mother's high, tinkling laugh that sounded like breaking glass, Preston's loud, sycophantic snicker. They were laughing at the sheer absurdity of it all. The idea of me, plain, sensible Claire, ever ascending to their level. The idea that my duplex and her mansion could even exist in the same universe. A hot tide of shame and fury rose from my chest into my face. I could feel the blood pounding in my ears. I wanted to scream, to shatter the crystal glass in my hand and watch them all flinch. I wanted to stand up and tell them that their legacy was a hollow shell, that their princess was a shallow fool, and that their king was a tyrant ruling over a kingdom of fools. But I did none of those things. That was not my role. My role was to absorb the blow, to swallow the poison and pretend it was nourishment. I picked up my fork, speared a single perfect raspberry from my plate, and brought it to my mouth. I chewed it slowly, deliberately, focusing on the texture and the taste. I swallowed the fruit and with it, the humiliation, the rage, and the grief. I swallowed it down deep, packing it into the cold, hard, dense place inside me where I kept all the other hurts. The place that I had, for years, been secretly turning from a wound into a weapon. That brunch wasn't a singular event, a sudden, unexpected betrayal. It was merely the grand, theatrical finale of a lifetime of being overlooked, undervalued, and systematically dismissed. It was the culmination of 30 years of playing a supporting role in the grand production of my family's life, a production in which Amelia was always the star. Growing up, Amelia was the sun, a dazzling celestial body around which my parents orbited. She was all sparkle and spontaneous charm, a natural performer who could coax $1,000 shopping spree from our father with a single, well-timed pout. I was the moon, quiet and orbiting at a distance. My light a pale, reflected thing that was only noticed when it wasn't there. I was analytical, introverted, and more comfortable with the clean logic of a circuit board than the messy, unpredictable dynamics of a cocktail party. In the Morgan family, this was not viewed as a different, equally valid way of being. It was seen as a fundamental defect, a social deficiency to be managed with a mixture of pity and impatience. The pattern was set so early, its grooves worn deep into the fabric of our family. I remember with painful clarity the year we both had a major science fair project due. I was 10, Amelia was 8. Amelia, who had no interest in science, constructed a volcano out of papier-mâché, baking soda, and red food coloring. She spent a single chaotic afternoon on it, getting more paint on her clothes and the Persian rug than on the project itself. Our father, utterly charmed by the mess and her dramatic flair, filmed the eruption with his big shoulder-mounted camcorder. He laughed and cheered as the red foam dribbled down the sides, proclaiming her his little scientist, a genius in the making. My project, by contrast, had been my obsession for weeks. I had designed and soldered my first simple circuit board, one that could turn a small light bulb on and off by clapping. I had devoured library books on basic electronics, saved my allowance for weeks to buy the parts at Radio Shack, and meticulously followed the diagrams, burning my fingers more than once on the hot soldering iron. When I finally got it to work, the feeling was electric, a jolt of pure creation. I presented it to my father with a heart full of pride. He glanced at it, his eyes glazed over with a profound indifference. The wires and resistors were a foreign language to him. "That's nice, Claire. Very clever," he'd said, his voice flat before turning his full, beaming attention back to Amelia. "Now, should we make the volcano erupt again?" I think I missed the best angle. In that moment, I learned a crucial lesson. In my family, a loud, colorful failure would always be celebrated over a quiet, complex success. This dynamic repeated itself endlessly, in countless variations. Amelia's effortless, superficial achievements were met with fanfare and praise. My hard-won, substantive accomplishments were met with a polite, vacant nod and a swift change of subject. When Amelia won a participation trophy in a horse riding competition, it was displayed on the mantelpiece. When I won the statewide math competition, my certificate was placed in a file folder in the study, a piece of administrative trivia. The schism deepened when it came to college. Amelia chose a prestigious, eye-wateringly expensive private university where she majored in art history, a degree my father saw as a sophisticated finishing school for a future socialite. They paid for it without a moment's hesitation, boasting to their friends about her Ivy League connections and her refined pursuits. I, on the other hand, had earned a place in MIT's elite computer science program. It was my dream, the culmination of years of quiet, obsessive work. I showed my father the acceptance letter, my hands trembling with excitement. He looked at it as if it were a bill for a service he hadn't ordered. A computer degree? He scoffed, handing the letter back to me. What are you going to do with that? Work in some dark basement with a bunch of nerds? It's a man's world, Claire. A world of deals and handshakes. You should study business, something practical. You can join the family firm, learn the ropes from me. He presented it as a generous offer, but it was a cage. He was offering to fund my future, but only if that future was a smaller, less threatening version of his own. He laid out the terms with the cold finality of a corporate edict. He would pay my tuition at the local state university, provided I majored in business. Anything else? MIT, computer science, my actual dreams, and I was entirely on my own. It wasn't a negotiation. It was an ultimatum, designed to break my ambition and force me into a mold I could never fit. My refusal was quiet but absolute. I took out a mountain of student loans. I worked 3 jobs, a grueling rotation of tutoring calculus to freshmen, waiting tables at a greasy diner, and coding rudimentary websites for small businesses late into the night. My room lit only by the glow of the monitor. I graduated with highest honors, a crippling amount of debt, and a core of steely resolve to never, ever depend on him for a single thing again. While I was juggling finals and double shifts, surviving on instant noodles and sheer willpower, Amelia was finding herself on a 6-month father-funded tour of Europe. Her Instagram feed was a curated gallery of effortless glamour, sipping wine in a Tuscan vineyard, posing in a designer gown in front of the Eiffel Tower, sailing on a yacht in the Greek Isles. My parents had her photos professionally printed and framed, creating a shrine to her carefree existence on the living room mantelpiece. My degree certificate, the tangible proof of 4 years of relentless, back-breaking work, was eventually placed in a drawer in the study, filed away with old utility bills and expired warranties. My father's dismissal of my career path was a constant grinding campaign. He referred to my burgeoning software consultancy, which I started from my tiny apartment with a second-hand computer, as Claire's little computer projects. He simply could not grasp what I did, and what he could not grasp, he could not value. To him, business was a blood sport played out on golf courses and in mahogany-paneled boardrooms. It was about hostile takeovers and gut feelings, not elegant lines of code and predictive data algorithms. He saw my work as a quaint hobby, like knitting or collecting stamps, something a woman did to occupy her time before finding a husband who could properly provide for her. The duplex he'd just gifted me was the perfect, brutal symbol of how he saw my entire existence. It was a rental property, a small, tangible asset he could comprehend. It was safe, manageable, and utterly devoid of ambition. In his mind, I was the reliable one, the one who was good with paperwork. He was anointing me the permanent, glorified property manager of the family's leftover scraps. While he handed Amelia the keys to the kingdom, my mother's comment at the brunch, "At least Amelia will carry the family name with dignity. Claire just works," had been the final devastating confirmation. To her, my work, my hard-won independence, my entire identity was a source of quiet shame. Work was what other people did. Morgans managed, they directed, they inherited. They didn't work. I vividly remembered the night the foundation of my secret life was laid. I was sitting on the floor of my small apartment a year ago, surrounded by takeout containers and books on corporate law. On my screen were the initial schematics for the software that would become the engine of my rebellion. It started as a simple platform to manage my own finances and the single rental property I had bought with my meager savings. But it grew into something more. It was a revolutionary property management platform that used predictive analytics to optimize rental income, streamline maintenance schedules, and, most importantly, identify undervalued properties for mass acquisition. It was complex, elegant, and brutally efficient. I had tried to explain it to my father once, in a last foolish attempt to bridge the chasm between us. I thought if he could just see the scale of it, the sheer audacious scope of my vision, he might finally understand. I prepared a full presentation, complete with market analysis and revenue projections. I brought my laptop to a family dinner. He let me get 3 slides in, his expression a mask of bored indulgence, before he held up a hand, stopping me mid-sentence. "Claire, Claire, Claire," he said with a weary, patronizing sigh. "This is all very technical. Very impressive, I'm sure. But you're missing the big picture. Real estate is about location, guts, and relationships. It's not about algorithms in a box." Amelia, sitting across from me, had giggled behind her hand. Later, as I was packing up my laptop, she'd patted my arm in a show of false sympathy. "It's okay, Claire," she'd said, her voice dripping with condescension. "We can't all be business-minded. That was the night I stopped trying. That was the night I stopped seeking their approval, realizing it was a currency I would never possess. So I decided to invent my own. I took my business plan not to my father, but to venture capitalists who saw the genius in the code. I built a team of brilliant outsiders who respected my vision, not my last name. I operated in absolute stealth, creating a holding company, Apex Innovations, a name with no connection to the Morgan legacy. While they saw Claire with her little rentals, I was building an empire in the shadows, fueled by the jet fuel of their constant grinding dismissal. Every condescending comment, every pitying look, every time they overlooked me, I took that sharp sting of pain and converted it into lines of code. I coded faster. I negotiated harder. I dreamed bigger. They had drawn a tiny circle and told me to stay inside it. They had no idea I was busy building a whole new universe. Back at the sun-drenched brunch table, my world had fractured into two distinct parallel realities. The first reality was the public one, the one visible to everyone else in the room. In that reality, I was Claire Morgan, the invisible daughter, the recipient of a token inheritance designed to highlight my own insignificance. I was smiling a tight, brittle, polite smile, while my sister, the newly crowned queen, basked in the glory of her ascension. My father was holding court, launching into a long, self-aggrandizing story about a corporate merger from the 1990s. Amelia, meanwhile, was passing her phone around, showing off the architect's renderings for the mansion's new interior design, which involved a lot of white marble and gold fixtures. It was all so crushingly predictable, so suffocatingly normal. But in my second reality, the secret one unfolding in the silent space behind my eyes, a seismic event had just occurred. My phone, which I had placed on my lap beneath the heavy linen tablecloth, had vibrated. It wasn't the gentle buzz of a text message or a social media notification. It was a single, sharp, urgent jolt, a custom haptic feedback I had programmed for one specific sender, for one specific purpose. It was the signal. My heart, which had been beating with a slow, resentful rhythm, suddenly began to pound against my ribs like a trapped bird. A cold, electric thrill shot through me, and my hands, which had been resting limply in my lap, now felt cold and clammy. I fought the overwhelming urge to look down, to confirm what I already knew. I kept my eyes fixed on my father's face, nodding at what I hoped were the appropriate moments in his story, pretending to be captivated. But my mind was no longer in that room. It was a million miles away, in encrypted servers, in secure boardrooms, in the complex, hidden architecture of my real life. For the past 6 months, I had been the silent, unseen orchestrator of the most audacious move of my career. My company, the unassuming and blandly named Apex Innovations, had been systematically and in complete secrecy preparing for a hostile takeover of Summit Holdings. Summit wasn't just another real estate firm. It was a titan, a behemoth of old money and established power. They owned a sprawling, multi-billion-dollar portfolio of luxury commercial skyscrapers, 5-star hotels, and exclusive residential properties across North America. They were everything my father respected and secretly envied: powerful, prestigious, and utterly ruthless. He often spoke of their legendary CEO, a man named Alistair Finch, with a reverence he usually reserved only for himself. In my father's world, Summit Holdings was the very definition of the corporate untouchables, and my little computer project was about to swallow it whole. The entire operation hinged on a single, critical vulnerability we had discovered months ago. Summit was a corporate dinosaur. They were powerful, but they were technologically archaic, running their vast empire on outdated software, inefficient legacy systems, and a stubborn refusal to innovate. Their entire infrastructure was a fortress with a poorly guarded back door, and my software was the key. We didn't just want to buy their assets. We wanted to absorb their entire operation, plug their portfolio into our predictive analytics platform, and unlock billions in hidden value. It was a high-stakes, high-risk gamble that had consumed every waking moment of my life for the better part of a year. I had barely slept, subsisting on a diet of black coffee and pure adrenaline, managing a clandestine team of brilliant lawyers, data analysts, and corporate brokers who knew me only as the disembodied voice on their encrypted calls. The final piece of the puzzle was a complex, highly leveraged buyout, a financial maneuver so precarious that it depended on absolute secrecy and perfect timing. The final wire transfers, the last digital handshakes, were all scheduled to be completed this morning, on a Sunday. A day when the old guard, the Alistair Finches of the world, would be on their yachts or golf courses, completely oblivious to the digital coup taking place. Slowly, with painstaking casualness, I pretended to adjust the napkin on my lap, using the movement as cover to glance down at my phone's screen. And there it was. An email from Maria Cortez, my lead counsel, a woman with the heart of a poet and the teeth of a great white shark. The subject line was all it took to knock the air from my lungs. Final confirmation. Tower acquisition approved. Congratulations, Ms. Morgan. My fingers, slick with a thin film of sweat, trembled as I tapped the screen to open the message. The body of the email was brief, all business. The final wire transfers had been completed at 9:41 a.m. The last of the regulatory hurdles had been cleared. The deal was officially, irrevocably done. As of this morning, Apex Innovations was the new majority shareholder and parent company of Summit Holdings, which meant that I was the new majority owner of Summit Holdings. A wave of vertigo washed over me, so intense I had to grip the edge of the table to steady myself. I read the words again and then a third time, letting their colossal weight settle in. The deal was valued at $3.8 billion. My personal net worth had just exploded into a stratosphere that my father, for all his boasting, could only dream of. The little rentals I managed had just become the foundation of a real estate empire that not only dwarfed his, but had the power to crush it without a second thought. The irony was so thick, so potent it was almost comical. At the very moment they were formally casting me out, handing me the symbolic crumbs of their legacy, I had secretly and silently seized a throne they didn't even know existed. And then, another, even more delicious detail clicked into place. The duplex on Cedar Street. My father's condescending, patronizing gift. I quickly accessed the mental database I kept of my company's recent acquisitions. Yes, I was certain. That entire block on Cedar Street, including the rundown duplex, had been bought up by a subsidiary of Summit Holdings 2 years ago as part of a larger package for future urban redevelopment. My father hadn't even bothered to do the basic due diligence on the scrap of property he had tossed my way. He had just gifted me a building that I, technically, already owned. A strange, dangerous calm washed over me, extinguishing the last embers of my humiliation, the anger, the grief, the years of feeling small and insignificant. It all began to recede, replaced by a cold, crystalline focus. This was no longer their story, with me as a minor character. This was my story now, and I was about to start a new chapter. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my ice water. The cold glass was a steadying anchor in a world that had just been turned upside down. I looked up from my phone, my face a mask of polite neutrality. I looked at my family, really looked at them, not as the towering, infallible giants of my childhood, but as they truly were, oblivious, arrogant, and about to become very, very confused. The game had changed. The rules were now mine to write. The brunch dragged on, a slow-motion tableau of my family's suffocating self-congratulation. Amelia was the undisputed star of this production, and she played her part with an unctuous, cloying enthusiasm. She unrolled the large, crisp deed to the mansion, spreading it across the mahogany table with the reverence of a scholar handling a sacred text. The paper was heavy, the calligraphy ornate and swirling. It wasn't just a legal document. It was a prop, a tangible symbol of her final, complete victory in the silent, lifelong war between us. "Look," she said, her voice giddy with triumph, holding it up for the room to admire. "It's also official. The Amelia Morgan estate. It has such a lovely ring to it, don't you think?" She traced her name on the paper with a perfectly polished nail, a gesture of ownership that was both profoundly childish and deeply arrogant. She then launched into a detailed, unsolicited monologue about her plans for the house. The library, my childhood sanctuary, was to be converted into a state-of-the-art yoga and Pilates studio. Our mother's prize-winning rose garden, a place of quiet beauty our grandfather had planted, was to be ripped out to make way for a larger saltwater infinity pool. She spoke of these destructions with the casual excitement of someone picking out new throw pillows, completely oblivious to the fact that she was erasing my history, my memories for the sake of her whims. My father watched her, his chest practically vibrating with pride. He saw her not just as his daughter, but as a flawless reflection of his own ruthless ambition, his legacy made beautiful and socially acceptable. Having settled Amelia's glorious future, he then turned his benevolent gaze to me. The warmth in his eyes instantly vanished, replaced by a cool, appraising look. It was the look an engineer gives a problematic but necessary piece of machinery. "Claire," he said, his voice carrying down the table, a clear signal that this was another public pronouncement. Now that Amelia is taking on a more significant role at the company, assuming her rightful place, perhaps we can find a proper place for you as well. I felt the eyes of the entire table, even the servers who were refilling water glasses, shift to me. This was another carefully orchestrated moment of public humiliation, disguised as generosity. He wasn't offering me an opportunity. He was offering me a tidy, well-defined box to be stored in. I was thinking, he continued, swirling the deep red Bordeaux in his glass, a man savoring his own power. We could create a position for you in the leasing department of Morgan Industries. You've always been reliable with paperwork, very meticulous. It's not glamorous work, Lord knows, he added with a chuckle, but it's steady. It would be an entry-level position, of course. A chance for you to start at the bottom and learn how real business is done. The unspoken words hung in the air, as thick and cloying as the scent of the lilies. This is all you are good for. This is your ceiling. Know your place. He was trying to colonize my future, to define it on his terms. He wanted to own me, to make me a small, functioning cog in his grand machine, forever under his thumb, forever grateful for his charity. He wanted to be able to point to me at cocktail parties and say, "See? Even my quiet, unambitious daughter has a place, thanks to my generosity." He even had the audacity to add, "And a steady paycheck will surely help with those student loans you insisted on taking. It's time you became more financially responsible." My chest tightened until it felt like a band of steel was being cranked around my ribs. The air was thick with the scent of roasted asparagus and my own silent, volcanic rage. The old Claire, the person who had walked into this house an hour ago, would have accepted. She would have smiled her tight, practiced, polite smile and said in a small, grateful voice, "Thank you, Father. I'll certainly consider it." She would have swallowed the insult, just as she had swallowed the laughter and the pity and the lifetime of dismissals. She would have done it because that was her role. That was the price of admission to this family. But the old Claire was dead. She had been quietly, efficiently, and permanently incinerated by the words on my phone screen. In her place stood someone new. Someone who was holding a live wire of immense, world-altering power in her hand. I looked at my father, at his smug, confident, utterly oblivious face. I looked at Amelia, who was smirking into her mimosa, visibly enjoying my public demotion. I looked at my mother, who was nodding slightly, her expression one of serene approval, as she always did, endorsing her husband's every decree, and I felt the final, frayed tether connecting me to my old life snap. For 30 years, I had been playing a game that was rigged against me. I had been diligently trying to earn points with a referee who would never, ever rule in my favor. I had contorted my personality, my dreams, my very being into shapes that I thought they would find acceptable, making myself smaller, quieter, less threatening, all in the desperate, pathetic hope of earning a crumb of their approval. And what had it gotten me? A rundown duplex on the wrong side of town, and an offer for a dead-end job designed to be a lifelong reminder of my own failure. The email in my pocket wasn't just a confirmation of a business deal. It was a declaration of independence. It was a key. It was the key to a door I never even knew existed. A door marked freedom. I didn't say a word. I simply held my father's gaze. The polite, strained smile on my face slowly, deliberately faded, replaced by a calm, cool, neutral expression. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to project gratitude or deference or anything at all. I was just looking at him, and in the prolonged, echoing silence, in my stark refusal to immediately accept his generous offer, a flicker of confusion, then irritation, crossed his face. He wasn't used to me being anything other than instantly, gratefully compliant. Amelia shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Say something, Claire," she hissed across the table. "You're being rude." This was the breaking point. Not a loud, shattering explosion, but a quiet, profound, internal shift. The decision was made, solidifying from a liquid hope into hard, unbreakable steel. I would no longer play their game. I would make them play mine. With a slow, deliberate movement, I carefully placed my linen napkin on the table beside my plate. "Excuse me," I said, my voice perfectly even and low, cutting through the tense silence. "I need to make a phone call." I pushed my chair back from the table. The sound of its legs scraping against the marble floor was unnaturally loud in the suddenly quiet room. I stood up, my back straight, my shoulders squared. The movement felt monumental, like the first step of a long journey. I turned and walked out of the dining room, my footsteps silent on the thick Persian rug. I didn't look back, but I could feel every eye in the room on me, a physical pressure on my skin. I could feel their collective surprise and irritation at my unprecedented breach of family protocol. Let them watch. Let them wonder. I stepped out onto the cool flagstone of the terrace, the fresh, clean air a welcome relief after the stuffy, poisoned atmosphere of the dining room. I walked to the edge, looking out over the perfectly manicured lawns. I pulled out my phone, my fingers steady now, no trace of a tremor. I scrolled through my contacts and found the name I was looking for. David Chen, my executive director, my co-conspirator, my most trusted ally. I pressed the call button and held the phone to my ear. He answered on the first ring as I knew he would. "Claire?" he said, his voice crisp and professional, but with an underlying note of tension. "Is everything okay? Is it done?" "Everything is perfect, David," I said, my voice firm, devoid of any of the emotion churning inside me like a storm. I looked back through the large glass doors at my family. They were still sitting around the table, now murmuring to each other, their faces a mixture of confusion and annoyance. From out here, behind the soundproof glass, they looked like fish in a very expensive, very small bowl. "Are you sure?" David asked, his voice low. "Once we issue the press release, there's no going back. The world will know." I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the free air. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," I said, a small, cold smile touching my lips for the first time that day. "Burn the ships, David. Proceed with the announcement." "Effective immediately." "Proceed with the announcement," I said, my voice a low, steady thing that bore no resemblance to the frantic thunder of my heart. "Effective immediately." On the other end of the line, David Chen, my executive director and the only other person on Earth who knew the full scope of my plan, was silent for a beat. He was a man of immense calm and precision, a former military strategist who saw business not as a game, but as a campaign. "Copy that, Claire," he said, his voice crisp and professional. "The press release is queued. The wire alerts are set. Consider the ships burned." There was another pause, and then, with a warmth that was rare for him, he added, "Congratulations. You did it." "We did it, David," I corrected him. "I'll be in touch." I ended the call, the finality of the click echoing in the sudden silence of the terrace. The phone in my hand felt both incredibly heavy, weighted with the billions of dollars and the lives it had just upended, and impossibly light, a tool that had just severed the chains I'd worn for 30 years. I didn't move. I simply stood there, gripping the cool metal, and breathed. For the first time all day, I took a full, deep breath, pulling the clean, fresh air into my lungs. It tasted of freedom. The world seemed to slow down, the colors of the garden sharpening into a vivid, surreal clarity. I could smell the rich, damp earth of the rose bushes, the very bushes Amelia planned to rip out for her saltwater pool. I could hear the distant, drowsy hum of a lawnmower from a neighboring estate, the gentle whisper of the wind through the tall cypress trees that lined the driveway. These were the sounds and smells of my childhood, but they felt different now. They were no longer the backdrop to my quiet suffering. They were just details in a landscape that I now, in a strange and very real sense, owned. I had 5 minutes, maybe 10, before the world caught up. I chose not to go back inside immediately. That room, with its oppressive air and ghosts of humiliations past, was my old life. I wanted to watch its final moments from the outside. I leaned against the cold stone balustrade, a silent observer watching a play through a one-way mirror. Through the large, sun-drenched windows, I could see my family. Their dynamic had already shifted. My father was looking at his ridiculously expensive watch, his brow furrowed with irritation at my prolonged absence. My mother was dabbing at her lips with a napkin, her posture stiff with disapproval. Amelia was whispering to her fiancé, Preston, and shot a venomous glare towards the terrace doors. They were annoyed by my breach of protocol, my small act of defiance. They had no idea that my walking away from the table was the least of their problems. My phone buzzed in my hand, a gentle notification this time. It was a text from my mother. "Whatever you are doing, it is rude. Come back to the table immediately." I smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached my eyes. I typed back a single word, "No." Then I silenced my phone and put it in my pocket. Inside, I saw my mother look at her phone, her eyes widening in disbelief. She showed the screen to my father. His face darkened. He was about to stand up, probably to come and drag me back to my seat by my ear like I was a rebellious child, when Preston's phone let out a loud, obnoxious chime. Preston, a man whose personality was a bland cocktail of inherited wealth and an obsession with the stock market, pulled his phone out. His smug expression faltered, replaced by a look of profound confusion. "That's weird," he said, his voice loud enough for me to hear a faint echo through the glass. "Really weird? What is it?" Amelia asked, annoyed that the attention had shifted from her. "The market's closed, but I just got a priority alert from my trading app." Preston said, squinting at the screen. It says trading on Summit Holdings has been halted, pending a major announcement. That can't be right. Summit is as stable as bedrock. My father let out a dismissive scoff. Nonsense, Preston. Your app is probably malfunctioning. Alistair Finch would never allow anything to happen to Summit. The man's a fortress. To prove his point, and to reassert his position as the ultimate authority on all things financial, my father picked up a remote from the sideboard and switched on the large, flat-screen television mounted in the adjacent sitting room, which was perfectly visible from the dining table. He flicked to the 24-hour business news channel, a smug look on his face, fully expecting to see the familiar ticker of stock prices scrolling peacefully along the bottom of the screen. He didn't get what he expected. Instead, the screen was filled with a bright red banner that read, "Breaking News." The face of a well-known financial news anchor was looking gravely into the camera. "We are coming to you with a developing story that is sending shockwaves through the global real estate market," she said, her voice urgent. "Sources have just confirmed that Summit Holdings, the multi-billion-dollar real estate giant, has been acquired in a stunningly swift and decisive hostile takeover." The effect on the room was instantaneous and absolute. It was as if someone had sucked all the air and sound out of the world. Forks froze halfway to mouths. My father's hand, holding the remote, was suspended in midair. Amelia, who had been lifting her mimosa for another triumphant sip, let the glass slip from her fingers. It shattered on the marble floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the deafening silence. Orange juice and champagne pooled around her ridiculously expensive shoes. The anchor continued, her voice the only sound in the universe. "The buyer is a relatively new but aggressive player in the tech sector, a privately held company by the name of Apex Innovations, which has until now operated largely in stealth mode. Analysts are scrambling to understand the details of this $3.8 billion deal, which appears to have been orchestrated with military precision." My father's face, which had been ruddy with wine and self-satisfaction, was now a pale mottled gray. He was shaking his head, a tiny, jerky movement of pure denial. "No," he whispered, the word a faint puff of air. "Impossible. Details are still emerging," the anchor said, looking down at a paper that had just been handed to her. "But we are now getting our first confirmation on the identity of the mind behind Apex Innovations, the new majority owner of Summit Holdings. And it is a name that is, until this moment, completely unknown to Wall Street." She looked back into the camera, her expression a mixture of professional poise and genuine surprise. "The new principal shareholder, and one of the youngest self-made billionaires in the country, is a 30-year-old software developer and entrepreneur by the name of Claire Morgan." I watched through the glass as my name, my own name, landed in the center of that opulent room like a meteorite. I saw my father stumble back a step, his hand clutching his chest as if he'd been physically struck. I saw my mother's hand fly to her mouth, her eyes wide with a horror that was almost comical. I saw Amelia's face, a perfect mask of beautiful, bovine confusion, her mind utterly incapable of processing the words she had just heard. And I saw Preston, her fiancé, slowly turn his head from the television screen to stare, not at Amelia, not at my father, but directly at me, through the glass, his jaw hanging open in slack-jawed, avaricious awe. The quiet revenge I had set in motion was over. The shock and awe campaign was about to begin. The silence in the dining room was a living thing, a thick, smothering presence that was broken only by the crisp, professional voice of the news anchor on the television. My family was a tableau of frozen shock, a collection of wax figures in a museum of their own obsolete power. My father, Richard Morgan, the titan of industry, looked as if his foundations had crumbled to dust beneath him. My mother, the silent partner in his reign, seemed to have shrunk, her cashmere sweater suddenly looking too large for her. And Amelia, the princess, was staring at the shattered mimosa glass on the floor as if it held the secrets to the universe. I chose that moment to make my entrance. I pushed open the heavy French door, the click of the latch unnaturally loud. I walked back into the room with a slowness that felt deliberate and powerful. Every eye swiveled to me, not with irritation now, but with a dawning, horrified comprehension. I was no longer Claire, the disappointing daughter. I was Claire Morgan, the name on the television, the ghost who had just materialized at their feast. I walked past the wreckage of Amelia's spilled drink and stopped at the edge of the table, not returning to my seat but standing in a position of authority, a position I had never before occupied in this house. My mother was the first to find her voice, though it was a thin, reedy thing full of cracks. "But, Claire," she stammered, her eyes wide and unblinking, She looked at me as if I were a stranger, an alien who had taken on her daughter's form. She couldn't finish the sentence. The words hung in the air between us, a testament to a lifetime of carefully curated soul-crushing dismissals. You're just a girl. You're just the quiet one. You're just… Claire. I finished it for her, my voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the silent room. Just a failure? I asked. A genuine question, not an accusation. Is that what you were going to say, Mother? The one who just works? My father finally seemed to reboot, his shock giving way to a sputtering red-faced rage. It was the only emotion he knew how to use to reclaim control. This is impossible, he roared, pointing a trembling finger at the television screen, where my name was now displayed under a picture they had pulled from my old university website. I looked young and terribly serious in it. How could you buy Summit Holdings? That's Alistair Finch's company. You don't have that kind of capital. This is a lie, a trick. I calmly reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I unlocked it and held it up, displaying the email from my lawyer, the one with the subject line that had changed the world. The confirmation, the dollar amounts, the legal finality of it all. It's not a trick, Father, I said, my voice as even and cool as the marble beneath my feet. It's just a business transaction, something you're supposed to understand. I let that sink in for a moment before I continued. You want to know how? It's simple, really. While you were mocking my little rentals and my silly computer projects, I was building the very software that half the companies in your own portfolio secretly use to manage their logistics. While you were celebrating Amelia for attending parties, I was securing patents. While you were teaching her how to be a brand, I was learning how to build an empire. You taught me, through years of consistent and painful dismissal, that the only person I could ever truly rely on was myself. You taught me that your approval was a game I was never meant to win. So, I decided to stop playing and build my own game, with my own rules. This, I said, gesturing from the television to the phone in my hand, is the result. The logic was too simple, too direct for him to refute. He could only stare at me, his mind trying and failing to reconcile the quiet, compliant daughter he thought he knew with the ruthless corporate raider standing before him. It was Amelia who brought the conversation from the global to the personal. Her mind, unable to grasp the enormities of finance and corporate takeovers, seized on the one thing she could understand, the one thing that truly mattered to her. But the mansion? She whispered, her voice a child's, her eyes wide with a dawning selfish horror. She looked at the heavy deed still lying on the table, the symbol of her worth, her future. Daddy gave it to me. It's mine. I allowed myself a small, sad smile. No, Amelia, it's not. Daddy gave you a piece of paper. But the asset itself, this house, this land, and about a dozen other Morgan family properties, were all held in a trust that was controlled by Summit Holdings. A clever tax shelter, I'm sure, I added, glancing at my father. But it means this house now belongs to Summit. And, I finished, letting the words fall like guillotines, Summit belongs to me. Amelia's face crumpled. The triumphant, smug princess vanished, replaced by a lost, bewildered little girl who had just had her favorite toy snatched away. The deed on the table suddenly looked like what it was, a worthless, empty promise. Preston, her fiancé, who had been silently staring at me with a look of terrifying intensity, finally spoke. His voice was no longer the braying, confident tone of a fellow aristocrat. It was the soft, obsequious murmur of a courtier addressing a queen. Claire, he said, taking a step towards me, away from Amelia. This is astounding, truly. I had no idea you had this in you. If you need any advice on how to manage the portfolio, my family has extensive experience. I cut him off with a single cold look. I don't think I'll be needing your advice, Preston. But thank you for the offer. His face flushed, and he quickly retreated, his brief, clumsy attempt at switching allegiances a spectacular failure. The other family members in the room, my aunts and uncles, were now looking back and forth between my father and me, as if watching a tennis match where one player had suddenly produced a rocket launcher. The old king was bleeding, and a new unknown power had just taken the throne. The carefully constructed world of the Morgan family, with its clear hierarchies and unspoken rules, had been shattered. And in the center of the wreckage, I stood, silent and waiting. While the family remained frozen in a state of suspended shock, the news anchor on the television continued to narrate the story of my new reality. Her voice, crisp and authoritative, filled the vacuum left by our silence, acting as a kind of Greek chorus to the unfolding family tragedy. We're getting more information now on Claire Morgan, she said, as a more professional, corporate-style photo of me appeared on the screen, one I had commissioned for this very day. Graduating with honors in computer science from the State University, Morgan founded Apex Innovations just 5 years ago. The company's proprietary software, a predictive analytics platform codenamed Cassandra, is reportedly a game-changer in real estate asset management. Sources are telling us that its ability to identify undervalued and mismanaged properties is what allowed Apex to engineer this stunningly effective takeover of an industry giant like Summit Holdings. At just 30 years old, Claire Morgan's meteoric rise from complete unknown to one of the most powerful figures in American real estate is, without a doubt, one of the most incredible stories of the year. Every word she spoke was another nail in the coffin of my father's authority, another brick in the foundation of my new life. He had called my work a silly computer project. The world was now calling it a game changer. He had seen me as a failure. The world was now calling me one of the most powerful figures in the country. Amelia seemed to finally be processing the new reality, and her reaction was predictably centered on her own loss. Her eyes fell to the heavy, ornate deed to the mansion, which was still lying on the table beside a smear of spilled mimosa. For a moment, she looked at it with a kind of desperate hope, as if it were a magic talisman that could reverse everything. Then, as my words finally sank in, it belongs to Summit, and Summit belongs to me. Her expression shifted to one of pure despair. The paper was no longer a symbol of her triumph, it was a monument to her humiliation. With a choked sob, she swiped her hand across the table, sending the worthless document fluttering to the floor, where it landed in the sticky orange puddle. That act of petulant destruction seemed to finally break my father out of his stupor. The shock in his eyes was replaced by the familiar, cold fury of a monarch whose divine right to rule has been challenged. He was a man who did not tolerate rebellion, especially from within his own ranks. He took a step towards me, his large frame seeming to swell with indignation. "This is a betrayal," he snarled, his voice low and menacing. "This is an attack on your own family." "No," I replied, my voice calm and even. I would not let him draw me into a screaming match. I would not play by his rules. This was a business decision. "Business?" he roared, his voice bouncing off the high ceilings. "You have destroyed this family. Everything I have built, everything I plan to pass down. You have spat on it. You will fix this, Claire. Do you hear me? You will undo this deal. You will sign Summit Holdings and all its assets over to me. You will give it back." It was the single most arrogant, most delusional demand I had ever heard. Even now, with his world in ruins around him, he still believed he could command me. He still believed he was the king, and I was just a disobedient subject to be brought to heel. He wasn't asking me. He was ordering me. For the first time that day, I laughed. It wasn't a happy sound. It was dry and sharp and utterly devoid of humor. "Give it back?" I repeated, the words tasting absurd on my tongue. "Let me make sure I understand. You want me to hand over my life's work, a multi-billion-dollar corporation, and just give it to you? The same way you gave me a rundown duplex this morning as a consolation prize." I took a step towards him, closing the distance between us until I could see the burst blood vessels in his eyes. I was no longer the scared child flinching from his anger. I was his equal. No, I was his superior, and the knowledge was a core of steel inside me. "Let's be honest, Father. You don't get to call this family now that it's convenient for you. Family isn't what we were. We were a corporation and you were its CEO. Amelia was your prized asset, your future brand ambassador, and I was the underperforming division, the one you were quietly planning to write off. You weren't a father to me. You were a manager, and you have just been subjected to a hostile takeover by the very asset you undervalued. These are business terms you should understand." His face went from red to a terrifying pale white. He was speechless, his usual arsenal of bluster and intimidation rendered completely useless. He had no power here, no leverage. He was just a man in a very expensive suit who had just been checkmated. "I am not destroying this family," I continued, my voice softening slightly, not with pity, but with a somber finality. "I am simply leaving it. I am reclaiming the dignity and respect you and Mother and Amelia decided I didn't deserve. I am taking back every moment you made me feel small, every success you ignored, every dream you mocked. I am not doing it for revenge," I lied, for it was, at least in part, for revenge. "I am doing it for me." I turned my gaze to my mother, who was weeping silently into a linen napkin, and then to Amelia, who was just staring blankly into space, a beautiful broken doll. They had been his willing accomplices, and their silence now was their only defense. The brunch was well and truly over. The other family members began to make their excuses, murmuring awkward goodbyes and practically fleeing the room, desperate to escape the toxic fallout. Preston, after one last longing look at me, scurried after them, abandoning his fiancée in the wreckage of her life. I looked around the grand, silent room one last time. It was a beautiful cage, and I was finally, irrevocably free. I turned and walked away from the three of them, leaving them alone with the shattered glass, the worthless deed, and the deafening sound of their world collapsing. I didn't run. I didn't storm out. I simply walked away, my footsteps echoing on the cold marble floor, each one taking me further and further into my new life. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of controlled chaos. My life was suddenly filled with board meetings, press conferences, and interviews with financial journalists who were all desperate to tell the story of the Cassandra of real estate. I moved into the executive penthouse suite of a hotel owned by Summit, a temporary measure until I could find a place of my own. My new home was a sterile, impersonal space of glass and steel, high above the city with a panoramic view of the skyline. From my window, I could see the distant, glittering lights of the financial district, the towers of my new empire. I worked 18-hour days, fueled by coffee and a relentless, driving need to prove that my success was not a fluke. In the quiet, lonely hours late at night, when the city below was a jeweled carpet of light, I had time to think. I had expected to feel a sense of triumphant, glorious revenge. I had imagined I would gloat, that I would savor my family's downfall. But the emotion that settled over me was something quieter, more complex. It was a strange mixture of profound relief and a deep, aching sadness for the family I had never truly had. The anger that had been my constant companion for so many years began to recede, leaving behind a hollow space. I had no contact with my family. They did not call. I did not text. We were in a cold war of silence. I learned through my lawyers that my father had been forced to step down as CEO of Morgan Industries, the board having lost confidence in his leadership after the public humiliation and the discovery of how many of his personal assets had been tied up in Summit. Amelia and Preston had, unsurprisingly, called off their engagement. Her value on the high society marriage market had plummeted along with her inheritance. They were adrift, cut loose from the moorings of the life they had always known. About a month after the brunch, I received a formal, stilted email from my mother, requesting a meeting. All three of them wanted to see me. I thought about refusing, but I knew I had to face them one last time. Not for them, but for me. To close the final chapter, I refused to meet them at my office or their home. I chose neutral territory, a quiet, private sitting room in a discreet old hotel, a place of hushed tones and dark wood. I arrived first, choosing a firm armchair, not one of the soft couches. When they walked in, I was shocked by their appearance. My father, who had always seemed larger than life, looked smaller, diminished. The arrogant fire in his eyes was gone, replaced by a weary, defeated haze. He had aged a decade in a month. My mother looked fragile, her face a web of fine lines I had never noticed before. And Amelia, all the sparkle was gone. She was dressed simply, her hair pulled back, her face pale and without makeup. The glittering, confident princess was gone, replaced by a subdued, uncertain young woman. They sat opposite me, a panel of defendants before their judge. The silence was heavy and awkward. Finally, it was Amelia who spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "The lawyers? They said we have to be out of the house by the end of the month." She looked down at her hands, unable to meet my eyes. "We have nowhere to go. Dad's accounts are frozen pending the board's investigation. Her voice broke. "We have no money." This was the moment I had fantasized about for years. The moment they would come to me, broken and begging. The moment I could finally unleash all the bitterness and rage I had stored up. I had 1,000 cutting remarks prepared, 1,000 ways to remind them of their cruelty. But looking at their pathetic, broken forms, I felt none of the triumphant glee I had expected. I just felt tired. "Where are we supposed to live, Claire?" Amelia asked again, this time looking up at me, her eyes filled with a desperate, pleading hope. I looked at her, and for the first time, I didn't see my rival or my tormentor. I just saw my sister, a girl who had been given everything and had therefore learned the value of nothing. She was as much a product of our parents' flawed values as I was. I took a breath. "There's a duplex on Cedar Street," I said, my voice calm and businesslike. "The one my father so generously gifted to me. It's clean, it's safe, and the tenants in the other unit are quiet. Unit A is currently vacant. The market rent is $2,000 a month. First and last month's rent required as a security deposit. You are welcome to fill out an application, just like everyone else." If your credit is good and your references check out, I see no reason why you wouldn't be approved. It was the most devastating thing I could have said, and yet I said it without a hint of malice. I wasn't trying to be cruel. I was offering them a solution, but a solution based on the rules of the real world, not the rigged game of the Morgan family. I was not their safety net. I was not their savior. I was a landlord. My father started to bluster, a faint echo of his old self. "How dare you?" I held up a hand and he fell silent. "I dare," I said simply. "This is the only offer on the table. Take it or leave it." In my new penthouse apartment, which I finally moved into a week later, I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the sprawling, indifferent city. I had won. I had everything I had ever dreamed of. Success, wealth, power, independence. But I finally understood what peace truly was. Peace wasn't about watching your enemies suffer. It wasn't about gloating or extracting revenge. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't something I had to give to them. It was something I had to give to myself. It was the act of releasing the anger, of letting go of the need for their apology or their approval. It was the understanding that their opinion of me was, and always had been, completely and utterly irrelevant. Real revenge isn't about burning bridges. It's about building a new world for yourself on the other side, a world so beautiful and strong that you no longer have any desire to look back at the ashes of the old one. And that's my story. They handed me humiliation on a silver platter, and I answered with the quiet, undeniable truth of my own success. Sometimes the strangest email, the one you never see coming, can change everything. If you want more stories of betrayal, quiet revenge, and ultimate redemption, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below, because you never know whose story I'll tell next.